obviously, many people have seen, I don't know who hasn't seen this. If you haven't, I don't know what's going on with you, but the just terrible bridge collapse that took place in Baltimore, the Key Bridge, Francis Scott Key Bridge there, a lot swirling around this issue. And to help us get into all of this, we are very, very honored to be joined by Dharna Noor, who is the fossil fuels and climate reporter at The Guardian, who is based in Baltimore and I know has been there on the ground. Dharna, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey y'all, thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. And, I just want to start. Maybe there's a lot of sort of conversation swirling around about, was this just sort of an unavoidable tragic accident that nothing could have happened? Does it speak to the infrastructure issues? What was going on vis-a-vis Baltimore in this regard? I mean, what have you been hearing and what's the conversation about sort of that element, the infrastructure collapse sort of angle on the story?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends who you ask. There are experts who say that the bridge was built in like the 70s. And so there are experts who say that it might not have really been built to withstand being around ships like the one that passed it. I mean, the ship that crashed into this bridge was massive, like truly massive, nothing on the scale that would have existed in the 70s. But I've also talked to engineering experts who have sort of said, no bridge could have withstood something like that. Should there be ships of that size in proximity to bridges that people are on, that workers are on? I don't know. I mean, that seems pretty dangerous. But I think this also tells us so much about like the issues with our social infrastructure, right? Most people in the city were sleeping when the bridge was hit. It was like 1:30 in the morning. But there were workers, immigrants, well, workers from Mexico, from Honduras, from various places in Central America, who were the ones who were working the overnight shift, fixing potholes so that people could have a safe ride to work in the morning. And they were the ones who, in some cases have perished. And it's really, I mean, it's just terrible, but it's obviously no surprise that they're the ones who are really bearing the absolute worst brunt of this disaster.
Yeah, and to speak to that particular element of this just horrific story, what kind of impact has the collapse had on workers in Baltimore? And right now, I'm speaking both of those who were working on the bridge and also those commuting. Um, and what has the impact been like in Baltimore as a whole?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think everyone in the city is sort of still in shock. I'm really used to, covering like pretty emotional stories about, pollution and about like, economic injustices, about labor violations. I'm used to covering these issues that like deeply affect me. But this time it was like I was calling up experts, I was doing these interviews before I even really knew who was on the bridge that night. So people were calling me to say like, are your loved ones safe? And I just had to say, I don't know. I have no idea yet, which was a pretty wild thing. But again, like the workers who I think are the most, the people who are going to be the most harshly affected by this are the families of several workers who have either been found, who've passed away in the waters, or are presumed dead now. So there's two workers whose bodies were recovered. There are four more workers who, maybe they will be recovered over the coming days. We've yet to see. And their families, of course, are just going through complete hell right now. I spoke with somebody who's a friend and coworker of those contractors who are again repairing potholes, who's basically just like, these were hardworking people. They were like using this money to support their families here. They were using that money to support their families back home, in their home countries. And the level of like disrespect that I think that they've been receiving, just as insult to injury. There's also, of course, the massive economic effect on like the rest of the city's economy. Baltimore's a port city. The port that hit the bridge was leaving the port, and right now that port is shut down until further notice. And there are thousands of people who rely on that work. There are thousands more who are, in the sort of contracting businesses, the restaurants, the material suppliers who are going to be affected by this. It could have really, really harsh effects for lots of people. And then, of course, the bridge itself could take like a decade to rebuild, which is going to be really difficult for a lot of people who rely on it to get to work and people who are essentially feeling kind of stranded because their bridge is the only way that they can get into the rest of the city. And so, pretty huge effects all over the place.
And you spoke to this, in the your answer to the first question. But I'm curious to know more about this. And I know you've been talking with folks a number of pieces. I mean, the fact that this has sort of focused us in, or maybe should focus us in on the issue of immigration here in this country. The type of work immigrants are doing, all of the demonization. I mean, this seems to also be an important sort of immigration story in terms of contextualizing like who is coming here and why, what they're actually contributing to the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, the right wing wasted no time at all, just like capitalizing on this and doing what they love to do, which is, injecting like a super racist narrative into this, saying that somehow the bridge was the result of like the borders being too open, which, is just a truly wild thing to say, and especially cruel seeing who was worst affected by this disaster. Um, I mean, I think it's notable again that like the workers who were doing that overnight shift were immigrants who were very likely not being paid particularly well. There were two people who were actually recovered from the waters shortly after the rescue mission began, and one of them denied health care. And we don't know, like maybe that's because he was totally fine, miraculously, maybe everything was like completely okay. But also, like knowing what we know about the sort of contractors who often work on that bridge, it could also be that he lacked healthcare, that he lacked immigration status, that he for some reason was scared, even though he fell into the water after being pummeled off of a bridge, that he was scared to receive healthcare. And I think that that really shows something is really, really broken about this city and this country.
I mean, the other speaking of broken, I mean, the other aspect of this that's gotten quite a bit of attention is these really absurd right wing, just completely racist conversations around uh, DEI and blaming DEI, I believe, meaning like diversity, equality, inclusiveness, for the collapse. And the mayor has pushed back pretty hard against that, saying that the people using that language are just too scared to use the N word. So, what's your reaction to this kind of response that we've seen being promoted by the right?
Yeah, I mean, I seeing somebody call Brandon Scott the DEI mayor, I don't even really know what that means. Like, is he just the DEI mayor because he's black? Like, or are you saying that he like was somehow like a diversity hire for the city, even though people elected him? I don't know. I feel like it's like so common that the right sort of injects this sort of rhetoric, even when they themselves, I think, don't even really know what they mean. Also, like when this is a majority black city, there are lots of like people of color throughout the city, and they're going to be the ones who are we're going to be the ones who are like rebuilding, and bearing the brunt of this fallout. It's not going to be like the whatever, like the Fox News commenters who are affected by this. It's probably going to be immigrants. It's probably going to be lots of black folks who are working to repair the damage, who are working to sort of rebuild the economy after this disaster. And that also is going to benefit like the rest of the United States and the world, because Baltimore is still a pretty major port. So I don't know. I think it's like pretty ridiculous, and honestly doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Even beyond being cruel, it just seems pretty nonsensical.
Yeah, I was so surprised. I was like, "Do people understand that the mayor is actually an elected official? Like, he can't just be chosen." But
A
yeah, I did
Griffin
just
Wire.
the fact someone even thought they could get something out of it is wild. Well, before we let you go, Darna, I mean, I know you've been on the scene, you've been talking to others. Anything else you feel people should know about what's happening in the Baltimore Bridge crisis that isn't really being covered?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just so much that we don't know yet, right? We're talking 2 days after this happened. It went down in like the middle of the night, and I think that that made it really, really hard to know the details immediately. But in the weeks ahead, I think there's going to be a lot of questions to answer. It seems like there were some toxic chemicals, for instance, on board some of those ships. What is the effect of that going to be? Who's going to be bearing the brunt of like that toxic pollution? Also, with the port shutdown, is that going to mean that there's more like massive diesel trucks on the streets of Baltimore, and particularly in streets of Baltimore that are already super super overburdened with pollution, and of course are often poor and working class and majority places of color. I think there's just a lot of potential cascading effects from this bridge collapse that we don't know about yet, and so I think lots to follow in the coming weeks.
Well, I hope everyone is following your byline. Good to have you there on the ground in Baltimore covering this, and we'll certainly have to have you back. Dharna Noor from The Guardian, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me and thanks for all you're doing.